Everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Drew. I'm an accredited exercise physiologist and Chinese medicine practitioner, and I love using exercise as movement medicine. In today's video, we're going to be exploring the role of the abdominal muscles in stabilizing the spine, the pelvis, and the thorax. So essentially, some of the principles in core training and why it's so important and how to understand that. Now, one of the things I always say is core training is breathing and breathing is core training. And the reason for that is because of the role of the diaphragm and the abdominals on getting air in and out of the lungs. Super important principle in anything to do with stabilization. But in this video, we're talking more about the role of the muscles and how we can understand it and apply it into exercise context. Now we're using app today is the Muscle in Motion Yoga app. You will find a link for the app in the description below. Highly recommend you get it. We're in the theory section and theory asana, core asanas here. You will find it in this section here, so you can have a look at yourself. We're going to go through the video. And of course, always like to acknowledge the original content creators here. So we have Dr. Gil Solberg and Amit Gal Alon. Hopefully I'm pronouncing those guys' names right. So they do a lot of the work in this app. So, definitely credit to those guys. So you're going to get my interpretation of what they're talking about. All right, so let's get into it. So let me maximize that. Okie dokie. All right, so examples for training the abdominal muscles in their stabilizing function. So let's pause here. So when we're talking about abdominal muscles, we're talking about the six-pack muscle here, the rectus abdominis. So 1, 2, 3. That's why it's called the six-pack, because these are the ones you often see. And then you've also got the lower abdominal fibers here. So technically it should be 8-pack, but for some reason it's always called six-pack. Then we've got the obliques. So we've got external and internal obliques. And then not shown here is the transverse abdominis, which are typically the six-pack or the core muscles. And then, of course, you've got things like the quadratus lumborum and the back extensors, which are the posterior muscles, which they are super important as well. So when you're doing things like sit-ups here or crunches, okay, that's the classic role of the abdominals, is to move either the torso. You can put that in kind of context here. So if you're sitting down in a chair, okay, it's the abdominals, which is actually going to pull you forward. So bring your torso over your hips, okay? But also then we have the core stabilization role here. So we have two classic yoga asana. We have our down dog and our tree pose. And it's the kind of yellow and the purple muscles here in the down dog, and the purple muscles here in the tree pose are stabilizing. So what does stabilizing mean? It essentially, muscles that stabilize keep the joints in relative position, so that the other larger movement muscles can then execute and move the bones, move the joints. Okay. So what we want is this nice balance of movement muscles creating the movement, and then stabilizing muscles, maintaining position of joints so that the bones can glide and slide. Because when you look at the structure of the bones, they all have convex, concave surfaces, which means there's a round surface, and then there's a smooth secondary round surface, like a ball socket, and they all fit and slide into each other, so they kind of can glide. So when you're looking at all the joints, there's no straight lines in the joints. Okay, so there's no just these joints. They usually have got some kind of concavity to them. So then there's a sliding action, or a rotational type of action which happens. Okay, very, very rare that you'll actually, apart from maybe the skull, that you have fully flat actual bones or joints. Okay, so when we start to introduce movement on the spine, we're going to have all these different actions happening. So here we go. In order to activate the abdominal muscles in the stabilizing aspect, conditions must be created that will enable their contraction while maintaining a neutral pelvic position. So when we're talking about neutral pelvic position, we're talking about is the natural lumbar curve that everyone will have, And everyone's lumbar curve is slightly different in terms of how much space is going to be between the spinous process in the lower back and then the floor. Okay, which will then be able to maintain your neutral pelvis position. So what's neutral pelvis? So neutral pelvis, if you get your pelvic bowl and you tilt it anteriorly all the way forward and you tilt it posterior all the way back, okay, and then you kind of go somewhere in the middle halfway, that's roughly going to be your neutral anterior pelvic tilt. Everyone's got slightly different angles and shapes in their pelvis, so there's not one set angle which is going to be exactly right for everybody. It's more that kind of finding the halfway position. So when we have a posterior tilt, okay, the abdominals will contract and pull the pubic bone upwards or superiorly, and that's going to roll the pelvic bowl posteriorly here. So I often use this as pull your zipper up. So where your zipper is on your pants, typically in this kind of area. So you're going to pull your zipper up this way. That means the abdominals are contracting and they're kind of creating this movement going upwards. That's the posterior pelvic tilt. And then we have where the lower back is compressed into the floor. Then we have the anterior pelvic tilt here, where the arch is created in your lower back. Okay, so here the abdominals are in a lengthened position, and the pelvis is rolled anteriorly or forward. So that pubic bone is now gone downwards. The tailbone here, the coccyx, is lifted up. Ischial tuberosity is also lifted up. So you kind of get this rotation this direction. So core stability or stabilizing the pelvis and the spine is about putting these pelvic positions in the right position so that the muscles can do their job correctly. That's what it's really about. Play through a little bit more. Good. So when activating abdominal muscles in the stabilizing aspect, the pelvis will maintain neutral. So in a lot of kind of core training, in a lot of weight lifting or conditioning type exercises, one of the key skills that we teach or you need to learn is how to organize the spine so you can find neutral position for you. Okay. And then understand how to contract your abdominals isometrically. So muscles, when they contract, they can lengthen under tension. That's eccentric. They shorten under tension. That's concentric. Or when they contract, but they don't, there's no movement. Okay, that's called isometric. So a lot of bracing work is isometric in nature. And what we're trying to do is maintain the pelvic position in a relatively still position so that the big ball and socket joint here in the femur and can rotate in the femur smoothly. Now, depending on the exercise you do, like if you're going into a deeper squat, you might need to actually create a movement in anterior tilt to change the angle so that you can get deeper in the squat. But again, that's going to be relative to everyone's individual pelvic anatomy. So a lot of it's really about just learning how to create neutral spine. So exercise 1, passive flexion of the thigh, heel slide. So if you're going to lie down on your back, okay, with your legs straight, what we're going to do here is we're just going to slowly bend the knee up and then slide the foot in and out. We do this exercise a lot in really early stage rehabs because it's quite a safe movement. It's supported, and you can use this exercise to kind of teach people how to reconnect with their breathing, reconnect to their abdominal wall, and get a sense of where the pelvis is in space. So as we run through it, here we have knee flexion and hip flexion. That's the heel slide. So you're just going to slide your foot along the floor. And the muscle that's creating that is the hip flexor, particularly the psoas here. Okay. So just keep that in the back of your mind. That's going to be important. The hamstring here will get a little bit of contracting work because it's going to help flex the knee. That's not really doing anything across the hip per se. Okay, so this is called the heel slide. And you can alternate it like this diagram is doing, or you can just do one slide at a time. Okay. Now let's have a little more detail. So I'll pause there. The greater hip flexion, the more pelvis will tend to posteriorly tilt. Okay, so what we're going to see here is when we bring the knee up into hip flexion, it's going to flatten the lumbar spine into the floor or create lumbar flexion. Let's see if it does that. So we've got the pelvis, and you can see when you step your feet in, you get more of a neutral spine. So typically people who've got lower back conditions when we're starting, they are typically a bit more comfortable in this position. Even though you're starting to get a bit more flexion in the spine, it really is kind of coming more into a neutral position when people have their legs fully out. That's creating more of an arch in people's backs. And that can be actually pretty uncomfortable for them. Now, particularly if they're quite tight in the hip flexors here, it's going to be pulling on the lumbar spine, and it's going to be like creating more of an arch, more of a tension or compression in the back. And so that can be potentially quite uncomfortable for people if they're experiencing back pain. So just keep that in mind. So often the first thing we do is we just want to neutralize the pelvis a bit more, because here it's a bit too anteriorly tilted. So when we bring the knees up to here, that posterior tilts it back more into a neutral position. Now, what we could do also is bring the knees right over the hips, okay? And that's going to, again, posterior tilt it further, and then that's going to put it into almost a fully neutral curve, okay? Or moving more into flexion per se. Typically, that's quite a comfortable position for a lot of people with back pain. So this is often where we start. We can also then use this position to orientate the landmark of the sacrum and the kind of middle thoracic spine, which are two good landmarks for people to kind of connect their body to, so they know where they are in space. And from there, we can then layer in exercises. Now, of course, the opposite of the posterior pelvic tilt is going to be the anterior pelvic tilt. So when those legs go out straight, you can see how the pelvis rolls back. You've got the pull of the rectus femoris and the pull of the psoas, particularly if they're tight. And then often in people who are experiencing lower back pain, they're tight. That creates more of an anterior tilt or more of a lumbar lordosis, which compresses the posterior components of the lumbar spine. So if you've got issues in your lower back, and you kind of close those joint spaces down, that potentially can cause more irritation. So the whole point of core training is to be able to neutralize the excessive curves in both directions. And here we've got this kind of balance between two. You've got the pull of the psoas and flexors trying to pull the pelvis into anterior tilt. And then you've got the contraction of the abdominal wall trying to pull the pelvis into posterior tilt. So if your abdominals are strong and you know how to orientate, okay, what you want to be able to do is contract these muscles isometrically and use your legs to extend out and slowly and maintain this kind of curve in your lower back. That's kind of the point of the core exercises. Pilates does this really, really, really well. Basically, pretty much all the Pilates movements are based on this kind of concept. Once you wrap your head around it, and then you just slowly layer in progressions, making positions and angles and adding resistance gradually over time, so you can get very, very strong core doing Pilates if it's done correctly and if you progress it. There will be a certain point though where, like, if strength training is your goal, you need to get into the gym and actually lift some weights and like develop strength that way. But I think Pilates is a really, really good system to learn how to kind of train the core. Okay, so in second exercise, active hip flexion, we're going to do like a classic bicycle type exercise. So here the feet are off the ground. So as soon as your feet leave the ground, the whole weight of the leg is now coming into the lower back, because it's the psoas muscle, hip flexor there. The whole weight of your leg is now transferring into your lower lumbar spine. So the abdominals need to be strong enough to tolerate that load to maintain that neutral pelvic position. Now, this is great. Watch the spinal movement here as the legs go in and out. So it's a bit of a natural movement. So one of the misconceptions in a lot of core training is everything needs to be like fully locked on, so there's no movement at all, which isn't really how the body's designed to move. You need enough abdominal contraction so everything is stable and that allows a little bit of natural movement. Because remember, these are all joints that require rotation or turning movements. If you lock everything down, then you actually restrict how much rotation can go into those joints as well. So there's a real nuanced balance between stability, mobility, and strength. And ideally, we want to match these three areas together: stability, mobility, and strength. If you concentrate on one too much than the other, then you'll get some kind of imbalance. Doesn't mean it'll be bad for you. It just means that when you get challenged in certain positions, certain actions, then you might get into trouble. So this is a really good angle here. So just notice this is the hip flexors here. This is your psoas. So they attach onto the 5 lumbar vertebrae and go onto the inner side of the femur into what's called the lesser trochanter. So roughly here. And so it's this muscle is literally pulling the femur or pulling your knee towards your chest. And then when the leg goes out, it's eccentrically lengthening to take the weight of that leg. Okay. So there's a lot of work going into the spine here. Okay. And a lot of movement in these joints when we're doing these kind of leg lever type exercises. So this is typically called a bicycle, but you know, it would, if you want to like give it an anatomical name, it would be something like in this position here. So it's a hip and knee extension, okay, against gravity, right, something like that. So you can see here, oh, I'll go back to touch. This is the attachment point of that psoas muscle coming in here. So you can see that it's literally pulling in this way here. So that means that all the loading is going into your lumbar spine. If these abdominals are weak, what's going to happen is that the lumbar spine is going to go into extension or create an anterior pelvic tilt. So lumbar extension and anterior pelvic tilt go together. It's the same thing. You can't extend the spine without anteriorly tilting the pelvis unless you're in a standing position potentially. At the same time, as the leg goes out straight, and if you remember from the previous example, when the leg went out straight, that also created more of an anterior tilt as well. Just because as the position of the pelvis is changing slightly, and then you've got the weight of the leg. So the abdominal wall, the anterior abdominal walls need to be super strong to tolerate that loading to maintain neutral spine. So really, really good exercise. So I prescribe this exercise a lot to help people create this connection in their back. And you can do it in 2 positions. You can do it lying down fully. So your pulse is on the ground, your back is on the ground, and you're resting on the base of your head. Okay, you're maintaining neutral spine and you're doing your bicycle type exercise, which is absolutely great. That's the safe version to do because the spine's in fairly neutral. And then we come up into what I call a low sit-up position. So just bringing the ribs down a little bit, flexing the spine so your lower back pushes into the floor, pardon me, and then you do the same movement. And then that's called, so you're in a low sit-up or off flex spine position, and then you're doing this exercise as well. So do 2 different positions to train in, okay, depending on the goal of what you want to do. Let's have a cup of my chai. So you can see here, it's rectus femoris and hip flexors, and their actions are, get me out of the way. Okay, so the hip, flex the hip. So you've got the rec fem and the psoas. They're trying to bring the knee towards the chest. That's hip flexion, like so. Now, the advanced training for your core is you then want to actually train hip flexion, so resisted hip flexion movement. So when you're lying down like this, you are going kind of across gravity. So gravity is the force that's coming straight down. So when the leg's in its full extended position, so in this position here, you've got gravity pushing down. It's like someone's trying to push down in your leg. Okay. So that means that you have to, that's the strongest part of the movement out here. Now, when the leg gets up to here, because gravity's pushing down, but the joint's stacked over the hip, the muscles don't need to do as much work. Okay. It's just not much force going into the leg. So the long lever position, that's the hardest part to do there when you're lying on your back. Okay. If you want to train your abdominal, your hip flexors, what you do is you lie down in this position, put an ankle strap on and put it attached to a pulley, and you pull your knee into your chest on that angle, and you'll get a really good hip flexion exercise. The alternative way to do it is you can go into a hanging raise. So like you know, chin up bar and just hang, lat set, and then just tuck your knees up to your chest and then slowly lower your knees down. So chin tuck up, tuck your knees up your chest and slow your legs down. You'll get a great kind of abdominal contraction doing that. Okay, so they will anterior pelvic tilt, great example of that. Pulling the anterior pelvic tilt into that position. So when you're doing your bicycles, what we want is this really nice example here of the abdominals as stabilizers. So you've got the rectus abdominis here, and then you've got the internal external obliques coming on the side angles. And remember those obliques, they wrap right around. So they will help stabilize from the front to the back. It's a really, really good demonstration of that exercise. So what you want is when you're training your core, you want this kind of concept of like this corset or a belt. And when you contract the muscles, they tense a little bit, but you don't need to pull them in. You just tense them. And that kind of creates this little bit of this 360-degree kind of compression. So then all your stomach contents here are then pushed into the spine, and that really gives that strong stabilizing effect. So what you can do is you can train to have different parts of the abdominal wall activating, depending on which positions you are in. So for example, if you roll onto your side, okay, it'll be the top abdominals which are resisting gravity more than the bottom. So actually side planks and kind of side lateral flexions are really, really good developing up obliques and QL strength. Bit more advanced exercise because of the loading, but can be really, really, really helpful. Okay, now here we have the double leg lever. This is one of my more advanced exercises that I prescribe with clients. So I typically would never give this exercise to anyone unless they know how to stabilize and organize their spine correctly, because the two legs together is going to put a huge torque into your lumbar spine. If you don't know how to activate the abdominals, you're just going to go straight into anterior tilt and you're going to compress your lumbar spine. So if you've got kind of disc issues or joint issues in your lower back, they're going to get irritated pretty quickly. So you can see here the pulse is not really moving. Let me just go back there. So in this position, it's not moving. So that's what stabilization is. So muscles are working. Hip flexors are moving the leg through space, but the spine is relatively neutral, so not a lot of movement. So remember though, like the more advanced core training is that you want to be able to flex and expand and rotate the spine with control, because that's the spine's designed to do that. What people need to do is slowly integrate progressive resistance and progressive overload in different angles and shapes and positions to train those joints. Yoga does this really, really well. The problem with yoga is it's very difficult to progress in terms of how do you take, for example, a triangle pose, which has a huge rotational component in the spine. It's probably it's a great expression of spinal function and health if people can do it correctly. But it's very hard to kind of progress outside of doing more repetitions. So that's where I think some limitations in yoga is they do have ceilings of where they can get to in terms of functional strength. Some things are used better in the gym, or moving into more what I call a calisthenics or a gymnastic strength training type approach, where they just take it to the next level. Okay. The only problem with the calisthenics approach is that it's huge volume and it's a little bit boring and tedious to do, but functionality wise, it's really, really good. But this is a you'll often, if you come to my Pilates class that I teach, you will see that exercise a lot. Now we get into the also controversial planks. Again, planks are so misunderstood. Like, we don't use planks to train the core on its own. You use planks to train people how to stabilize the core under resistance, under loading, and then you integrate that kind of connection of the body into movement. So in this diagram here, they're showing two poles, and basically you've got a truss, and the only thing that's really stabilizing this is the abdominals here. So this would be the pelvis, this would be the torso, and then you've got this kind of saggy bit in the middle. So you need stabilization in the saggy bit. So my engineer friends, I'm sure, will understand. So here, in a classic plank position, typically we'll start off on knees, because as soon as you come up on the toes, you've got the full weight of the body now going into the lumbar position here. So your center of gravity is going to be around this region. And so that means that the line of pull is going to be going down through that position. And between the pelvis here and the ribs, all you've really got to stabilize and support yourself, apart from the spinal column, is the muscular wall. So you got your lumbar extensors, your quadratus lumborum, your obliques, and your anterior core. So if they're not engaged, they're not contracting isometrically, they're not stabilizing, you're going to have a really hard time maintaining your organized spinal alignment, which means that you can kind of compress or irritate joints. So let's have a look here. So we've still got our hip flexors in play here. If they're tight, they're going to rotate that pelvis forward. Okay, that's going to anterior tilt. So you're going to get an arch in your lower back. So when you're training people in planks, you're looking for the excessive arching in the lower back. That could be due to tight hip flexors. To counteract that kind of pull, we've got the abdominal wall below and the obliques, which are trying to then posterior tilt. So tuck your tailbone under a little bit, and to get that stabilization roll. So we're really trying to prevent this anterior tilting through here. So you'll see when people start to fatigue out, this happens. You'll see them when people are doing planks or push-ups. You'll see it in push-ups a lot. You'll get this big sag in the midsection. The pelvis will anterior tilt, and then the ribs will kind of flare. And so like this whole rib cage, basically the chest lifts a little bit, and then you get this kind of saggy bum kind of thing. So the correction to that is, what you want to do is cue people to push into their elbows and spread their chest, push their chest away from the floor and spread the shoulder blades apart, so that they're stabilizing with the shoulder muscles, the serratus anterior particularly. Okay. Then you want to get them to contract their abdominals, pull the bottom rib down towards the tip of the pelvis. So imagine you pulling your ribs towards your hips that way, or think bottom rib down. And then you want to tuck your tailbone under into posterior tilt. Okay. So that's going to have a slight rounding in your back in the opposite direction. And in a plank, that's what you want. You want a slight posterior tilt. Okay, you're going to still maintain relative good neutral curve in your lumbar back, moving towards more flexion. But in this position, you'll be a lot stronger. Now, if you want to get into the strongest position, then you go into what's called the hold out kind of plank, where you really get the tail tucked under into the posterior tilt. Abs will be on fully engaged. The back muscles will be lengthened. So then that's actually a great way to stretch out your lower back, is to get into this kind of real hold out position. But if you're doing push-ups or planks, the goal is really to maintain neutral. And then what you do is you transfer this ability to maintain neutral spine into a movement. So let's look at a movement such as eagle pose. I quite like eagle pose. Give it a second. So what we're doing here is we're going to squat down, cross your arms, pause. Let's pause there. So you're standing one leg, okay? You're squatting down a little bit, okay? And what you want to do is keep your pelvis level here. Now, what's keeping your pelvis level here is your glute medius, your adductors, and your quadratus lumborum, obliques on the back, extensor muscles here, your lumbar extensors, and your core muscles here. So when you're doing single leg stance work, it doesn't really matter what exercise it is. You could transfer this to a single leg hip hinge, like a suitcase deadlift, something like that in the gym. This kind of single sided work, where the body's going to be naturally kind of pulled to one side. You have to be able to use your stabilizers to maintain the position. And the key is always maintaining level pelvic position when you're doing your abdominal work. Okay. So the core training that you do, it should transfer into your ability to do other exercises, particularly. These ab muscles, they are slow twitch fibers, which means they're designed to be contracting frequently throughout the day at a low frequency and rate, and they don't generate a lot of force. So they're not really strong movement muscles. They're postural muscles, which maintain position and alignment throughout the day. So one thing you want to do is when you're doing your core work is first, you always build up strength so that the muscles can execute the movement with control. And that's kind of part strength and part motor control. And the second part is then you want to build up muscular endurance so that they can tolerate progressive loads over a longer period of time. And then that hopefully then translates into more of a real world situation where the body is adapted and resilient to be able to tolerate and handle loads throughout the day in different positions. And one of the reasons I do like yoga is because you train in all these kind of weird, funky positions. And that kind of gives your body this movement resiliency, which is really, really handy, versus if you're just training a squat, a hinge in the gym, you're really good at those two movements. But when you get outside of those movement patterns, they may not necessarily translate as much. The exercise therapy rare people love to argue about all this stuff, and typically there's always outliers and then the extremes. But typically, if you're just training and you're kind of sticking to these principles, it doesn't really matter if you're in the gym, if you're doing yoga, if you're doing Pilates, because the body's the body. If you follow the principles of the movement and how to execute, you're going to get pretty good results. So I've got great results with clients doing yoga, doing Pilates, doing kettlebell training, and just doing traditional kind of like strength conditioning, barbell, dumbbell type work. And also integrating different systems together. It all works because the body doesn't really know if you're doing yoga or Pilates or strength training. It just knows movement. So when you train movement, things just tend to work well. When things work well, pain and dysfunction tend to decrease sometimes, and they just resolve and go away. So when you can get someone to a full range pain-free movement, and then they can go off and do the things they like to do, it's a pretty cool thing to do. So that's probably enough on this topic today. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Drop me a comment. Always happy to answer them, and we'll see you in the next video. Of course, don't forget, if you haven't already, to like and subscribe. And yeah, thanks for watching. See you next time.